There are moments in war when the impossible does not gradually become possible. It simply happens, all at once, without warning, without the permission of conventional wisdom or the blessing of military doctrine. One morning, the map looks the same as it did the day before. And then, before the afternoon briefings are even finished, everything has changed. This was one of those mornings. For months, Russian commanders had been confident, not quietly confident, openly, declaratively, almost dismissively confident. Vladimir Putin himself had stood before the cameras and suggested that certain things simply could not happen, that certain lines could not be crossed, that Ukraine, whatever its courage and whatever weapons its Western allies funneled across the border, lacked the reach, the capability, and the strategic vision to strike where it would truly hurt. He said the words. His generals echoed them. State media repeated them on a loop until they became something approaching official truth. And then Ukraine did exactly that thing. What happened in the days that followed did not just change a tactical situation on a front line somewhere in Eastern Europe. It sent a message that echoed from Washington to Beijing, from NATO headquarters in Brussels to the Iranian Defense Ministry, from the think tanks of London to the war rooms of Seoul. The message was simple, and it was devastating. Russia's strategic assumptions were wrong, and Ukraine had just proved it, not with a speech, not with a press release, but with fire, precision, and extraordinary audacity. This is the story of how it happened. This is the story of what it means, and this is the story of what comes next in a war that continues to defy every prediction ever made about it. To understand why this moment was so significant, you have to understand what Russia believed about itself going into this war, and what it continued to believe even as the months turned into years and the casualty figures climbed into the hundreds of thousands. When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine on February 24, 2022, the Kremlin's internal calculus was built on a set of assumptions that seemed, from Moscow's perspective, entirely reasonable. Ukraine's military would collapse within days. The government in Kyiv would flee or capitulate. Western nations would issue stern statements and then quietly accept the new reality on the ground. NATO would not risk a broader confrontation. And Russia, with its vast nuclear arsenal and its status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, would remain essentially untouchable on its own territory and in the strategic depth around it. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. But Russia did not simply abandon its assumptions when they failed. Instead, it adapted them. The war that was supposed to last 72 hours became a grinding, attritional conflict that stretched across seasons and years. And yet, even as the battlefield humiliated Russian expectations again and again, certain core beliefs persisted. Chief among them was this: Ukraine could not project meaningful force deep into Russian territory. Ukraine could not strike the infrastructure that sustained the Russian war machine. Ukraine could not, in any operationally significant way, bring the war home to Russia itself. Putin had made statements to this effect with a confidence that was striking in its specificity. When Ukrainian forces first began striking targets inside Russian border regions in 2022 and 2023, Moscow downplayed each incident. When Ukrainian drone campaigns began reaching further, Russian state media was instructed to minimize coverage. The official line, maintained with remarkable consistency, was that these were nuisances, propaganda gestures, not strategic realities. Russia's air defenses were sophisticated. Russia's territory was vast. Russia's critical infrastructure was protected. And then there was the question of certain specific targets that military analysts had long discussed as theoretically significant, but practically unreachable. Targets deep inside Russia. Targets that, if struck, would not just damage hardware or disrupt logistics, they would shatter the psychological architecture of the war. They would prove that no corner of Russia was beyond Ukraine's reach. They would demonstrate that the Kremlin's narrative of invulnerability was not a military assessment, it was a performance. In the months before the breakthrough, something was changing in the way Ukraine approached the war. It was not immediately obvious to outside observers. It was not loudly announced. But those who were watching closely, the analysts who tracked satellite imagery, the intelligence professionals who monitored electronic signatures, the frontline journalists who noticed changes in Ukrainian military behavior, began to sense that something was being prepared. Ukraine's drone program had been evolving at a pace that was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of modern warfare. What had started as relatively crude, improvised unmanned aerial vehicles was transforming into a sophisticated and layered capability. Ukrainian engineers, operating under wartime conditions with limited resources but extraordinary motivation, had been iterating through drone designs at a speed that traditional defense procurement cycles cannot match. Each generation of vehicle flew further, carried more, navigated better, and evaded detection more effectively than the last. Simultaneously, Ukraine's intelligence services had been conducting an extensive and patient campaign of target identification. The GUR, Ukraine's military intelligence directorate, had been building a detailed picture of Russian strategic assets for years, and that picture had been refined and updated continuously throughout the war. They knew where things were. They knew what those things did, and increasingly, they knew how to reach them. There was also a shift in Western policy, slow and contentious, but ultimately consequential. The debate within NATO about what weapons Ukraine could and could not use, and where it could and could not